I'm going to pick this up where I left off. Um, Two of the key factors in sort of keeping this consciousness of the Roman Empire come from, as I was mentioning, this idea of the people that came in and pillaged Rome and overtook those areas being in awe of the monumental buildings, right, and the riches of Rome. That was part of the reason that they were invading and doing that. But the second one is the survival of the Christian church, which sees itself as an extension of the Roman Empire. Hence, later on, how we come to the Holy Roman Empire, which is a completely different thing than the initial part. And the early Christian church, right, was, as we looked at last week, was basically illegal for 300 years, and then it was ushered into and made part of Roman culture. But with the decay of that, the the church naturally looks, and by this time there is a pope, okay, naturally looks back at that time period as a time period where the church took a role in leadership. Okay, so some other things that we have to look at are that during that time period where there are no cities, there's this sort of this decay to the point where all you have are maybe villages or small towns. The idea of a monastery, right, a place where people dedicate themselves to religion and intellectual pursuit, becomes one of the things that creates buildings. It creates the replacement of a city. Okay, and as a matter of fact, many monasteries later on became the center of a much larger city. We're going to talk about this period called the Carolingian period, which is the period of Charlemagne's rule. And in that time period, the monastery becomes this really important place. They are the ones that have established libraries. They're the ones that have saved the literature of antiquity from being destroyed, because when the barbarians, the Huns, would come in, they would literally burn the libraries. They wanted to destroy the culture. Okay, it's also in these monasteries that there is a maintenance of some level of skill, of cutting stone, of being able to make mortar, of being able to grow agriculture. Those things disappear from most people's lives. And in the creation of these monasteries, there is this idea of building not just the monastery, but a church for the monastery. Okay, so that's one of the things where we see building occurring in the early Middle Ages. The next thing that has an influence on the medieval period, right, the Middle Ages period, is the advent of this idea of a Christian pilgrimage. Okay, it's in this time period that Jerusalem falls to the Muslims. And so people that would normally have taken a pilgrimage to visit the Holy Land are no longer able to do that. And so there are other places within Europe that they go to. Santiago de Compostela is one of them that's in Spain. And so I forgot, there was a movie that was made by, I think, Emilio Estevez and his father, called The Way, and it's about the walk, this path to Compostela. That in turn leads to the building of churches on the pilgrimage routes to places like Compostela. And the reason that people are going to visit these churches are to come in contact with the relics that are in the churches. Now, you guys might wonder, what is a relic? Well, a relic is any thing or part of a saint. So it could be something as benign as, a shawl or an article of clothing. It could also be something as bizarre as a finger or a hand or a head. And all of those things are preserved as relics, and people go to visit them, right? And in visiting them, they acquire knowledge and they acquire some level of sort of religious experience. And then the other thing that leads to a reestablishment of the idea of building for empire or building for the common good is the rule of Charlemagne in the Carolingian period. In that time period, he considered Rome at the time of Constantine. Remember that Constantine was the first emperor to convert to Christianity and the first emperor to sort of make Christianity legal. Okay, he considers that time period to be a model for what a Christian leader should be like. Okay, they launch a deliberate sort of campaign to build this sort of imposing monumental architecture. Unfortunately, they've lost a lot of the skill and ability to do that and the knowledge of how to do that. The architecture that they build is sometimes called pre-Romanesque because it's kind of the first step in the evolution of the overall architecture of the Middle Ages. There's another component that we'll be talking about next week, which is an outgrowth of the Romanesque, which is called Gothic. Okay, very different than the Romanesque period, but literally connected to it, an outgrowth straight from it, all considered part of the medieval period. Finally, the Crusades are another thing that has an impact on architecture of the Romanesque. As the knights that go out and crusade take over lands, they build castles, they build defensible structures, they build churches. And so that is another one of the things that starts to create buildings during this time period. Some influences on the architecture of the Middle Ages are things that we're going to kind of have to look at from a more pragmatic sort of perspective. So the very first thing, there is no longer this culture that existed in Rome, right? And so most of culture is now centered upon the church. And as a result of that, the churches have to grow bigger and bigger. And so they have to accommodate a whole series of different religious ceremonies and liturgies. There is the pilgrimage, right, where they have to now store the relics and all of these things in these chapels that people are going to come visit. And that those visitations from the pilgrims are taking place at the same time that normal life takes place and normal mass takes place and the normal use of the church and the spaces around the church takes place. Okay. The second thing that occurs is there's a realization that torches and candles really cannot illuminate a space very well. And so there becomes a need to light the interior of the space in a more substantial way. And that leads to this idea of bringing the nave up higher past the side aisles and opening up that area called the clerestory. Another thing that sort of occurs and influences is fire. A lot of early churches burn because they're built from timber. And so they start using masonry instead of wood because it has higher fire resistance. Okay, it leads to this notion of a modular vaulting or a modular sort of replication of architecture, or not of architecture, but of architectural elements, where the vaults, which we'll talk about what they are shortly, sit on these big gigantic piers that support the sort of structure of the nave. And then finally there's these buttresses. The buttresses, as the building gets taller, you've got to do something to keep it from falling over, right? And so the buttresses become the first sort of method of doing that. They kind of create heavy masses that push towards the center of the nave. And I'm going to stop this here also because we're at the end of part 1.